This is a diagram of the most elemental unit of the brain, nerve cells or neurons. This picture shows two adjacent neurons. The inset picture shows that these adjacent neurons do not actually touch one another. They're separated by a tiny space called a synapse. The synapse is where everything is stored. The synapse is where everything happens. Each synapse is a tiny biochemical microprocessor. In a computer, this switch or microprocessor is an electrical circuit that is either on or off. The brain is similar in that the switch either fires the next neuron or it doesn't, on or off, but there are some major differences. Synapses are not just on or off. With almost an infinite number of chemical combinations, the flavor and strength of the switching properties are modulated in countless ways. Each synapse has both memory storage and information processing elements. It's much more than a mere on-off switch like a computer. In fact, one synapse can contain something on the order of 1,000 molecular scale switches. There's another major difference. The brain contains neural growth factor, which is a protein known as a neurotrophin. Each time we fire a neuron, the brain secretes neural growth factor, which stimulates the neuron to sprout new dendrites. So unlike a computer, these circuits actually grow. These new dendrites, then, are poised and ready to fire additional synapses the next time that neuron is fired. It's important to note that this process occurs each and every time we fire a thought, even if it's a thought we have thought many times before. The bottom line is that every single thought counts. They're cumulative. We might fire the same neurons, but we are connecting tens of thousands of new synapses. Thoughts create actual matter. They take up space. They have mass. And this process, as we have said before, is known as neuroplasticity. Neural growth factor is analogous to human growth hormone, which is secreted each time muscle tissue is fired. Each time a muscle cell is fired, it also grows new fibers, which grow in size and strength to carry the heavier load. Now, this can easily be observed in muscle tissue. We can't observe it so readily in the brain, but it is happening just the same. Thus, with each passing thought, the network of neurons grows stronger and faster. This picture is an actual picture of some neurons. The very reason that we can say with certainty that neuroplasticity is happening is because we can now see it happening. We can take pictures of neurons and watch them in action. This has only been possible within about the past couple of decades. Before, we were unable to observe neuroplasticity. But with the advent of CAT scans, PET scans, and functional MRIs, we can now peer into the brain. We've only had the computing power to run these machines for a relatively short period of time. And it's also significant to note that prior to this technology, neuroscientists believed that neuroplasticity could not happen. This slide is the first in a series of slides that show how changes happen at the neurobiological level in the brain. This slide represents one neuron connecting to one adjacent neuron. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to have this drawing represent one thought. In reality, if it were one thought, we would have thousands of these connections. But for simplicity's sake, we'll say this is one thought. And we're going to designate this thought as the thought, I don't care. As in, it doesn't matter if I eat this donut right now, I just don't care. Now, I chose this thought because it's a very popular thought. Folks use it all the time to make it okay to eat something they know they shouldn't. I also chose it because I think it represents the quintessential default thought, in that it nicely represents the illogical nature of our brains. Of course we care. If we didn't, we wouldn't be watching this video. But yet, in that moment, when we're eyeing the donut, we're able to slide our logical thinking mind aside just long enough to get that donut in the mouth. And then afterwards, of course, yeah, we do care. Then comes the guilt, the shame, the self-loathing, the I really think I'm a failure thinking. Now, it's not so important at this point that we know where these thoughts originated in the first place, but rather to recognize that somewhere along the lines, our brains picked these thoughts up as a convenient thought to give permission to eat a donut, even when we know we shouldn't. Now, as random thoughts occur in our lifetimes, dendrites grow and grow and grow and form new connections with multiple adjacent neurons. Each new connection forms thousands of synapses, the tiny space between the dendrite and the adjacent neuron. So how many of these are we creating each day? How many thoughts do we have per day? Scientists estimate in the 100,000s. It's a huge number. And throughout the course of a day, a week, a lifetime, that really adds up. Here are some facts about the brain. A typical healthy brain houses some 100 billion nerve cells, which are connected to one another via hundreds of trillions of synapses. There are approximately as many neurons in one human brain as there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. Each synapse, again, functions like a tiny microprocessor, and tens of thousands of them can connect to a single neuron, which connects to thousands of adjacent neurons. The adult human brain is estimated to contain the capacity to form up to 500 trillion synapses. Now, just to give that some perspective, a single human brain has more switches than all the computers, all the routers, all the internet connections on the entire Earth combined. That's a staggering amount of thought. In fact, by the time you're done watching this video, you will have created several million new synapses in your brain just to process, catalog, and remember this new information. That's a ton of cognitive horsepower. Yet most of us are doing very little to control that horsepower. And if we're going to get good at beating food addictions, good at putting the fork down, we have to get good at controlling this process. On this slide, the red arrow indicates where a new distinct pathway is beginning to form, as a new thought or set of thoughts is repeated. Now, it could be one dominant thought that is repeated all the time, or a combination of thoughts, a thought pattern. And we'll call this thought a perspective. So let's say that this particular perspective is, again, I just don't care, and all of its cousins. Just go ahead and eat it. It's not that big a deal, doesn't matter anyway, everyone else is doing it. You know, it's a celebration. Live a little. Go ahead, celebrate. Now, if this happens to be my perspective, the set of thoughts that make up my perspective, when I'm faced with a decision about what to eat or how much, I am more likely to choose poorly or to overeat. And each time I think this way, I'm strengthening this perspective, one thought at a time. The more I use this way of thinking, the stronger this pathway or perspective gets. Over time, this repeated thought pattern establishes a default pathway. I like to think of these individual thoughts as cognitive footprints that are forming this default pathway. So now we have a default perspective that practically ensures that we will continue to make poor food choices and or eat too much. By the time one is an adult in his or her 40s, one has made food choices roughly 70,000 times. Now multiply that by the number of likely thoughts involved and the number of individual synapses comprising those thoughts, and we're easily into the tens of billions of bits of information that now support our eating habits. That represents a very robust default circuit supporting all of this thinking that we no longer want. And if firing this circuit involves the release of dopamine, which we know that eating does, this circuit becomes quite strong quite quickly. Dopamine is the chief neurotransmitter involved in the formation of addictions. Now that's a whole separate topic for a whole nother day, but I want to at least mention it here. Dopamine is literally fertilizer for these pathways. This next slide indicates the very beginning of what we're going to call cognitive editing or cognitive restructuring. The lone red line on this slide indicates a preferred thought, a target thought, a neutralizing thought that we would like to be thinking instead of the normal default thought. They would be thoughts like, I do care. I do care a lot. It is a big deal. It does matter, and I do matter. And you know, I can celebrate just fine without overeating. Now this new thought, or set of thoughts, is a very weak signal at first compared to the default. This is due to the law of physics, which govern brain activity. It says that most thought will still be channeled down the default pathway. That's how our brains really work. Logic and intellect cannot overpower physics. The electricity that carries our thoughts follows a path of least resistance, which is the bigger and the stronger pathway. It's just that simple. Physics trumps logic. Physics trumps desire. This, my friends, is the reason we can know better and do it anyway. It's not a mystery after all. It's simply quantum physics. But as we keep repeating the new thoughts, the new circuit begins to grow. This slide shows a few additional connections. Now these new connections are being achieved by actually thinking the new thought. Remember, each time we think the new thought, we're stimulating growth of this new circuit, the red circuit. These new thoughts literally must be repeated, practiced, over and over. Now we can accelerate this process, but only by so much. We're limited by math, by chemistry, by physics. Terminal velocity is the term that I give to the maximum speed at which we can create these new synapses. And this process simply cannot be short-circuited. The red circuit on this slide contains logical thought, but remember, logic does not trump physics. And this can be a very frustrating place to be. And we cannot circumvent this stage with all the willpower or motivation in the world, only with practice and repetition. Now yes, we might be able to send some of our thoughts up the red pathway sometimes with great effort, but ultimately the black circuit will win the war because of physics. It's simply bigger and faster. The first thing you're going to notice on this slide is some thicker red lines. These thicker red lines represent a written thought. Fortunately, we do have a way to catch up to that black circuit. And the key to catching the black circuit is to create a greater number of synapses with each passing thought. Now this is achieved by loading this red circuit, the new one, in written language. Writing a preferred thought requires 10 times the number of synapses of just thinking that thought alone. Why? It's actually quite simple. We must engage every lobe of the cerebral cortex to complete a written thought. When writing a thought, we must engage language skills, fine and large motor skills, sensory input, and visual input. The number of synapses required to put together a written thought is exponentially greater than simply thinking that thought. So over time, and with much repetition in writing, the new thought grows to the point where it is approaching equilibrium. The new way of thinking is now becoming a viable rival to the old default pathway. Even when we can make use of a technique that increases the effort exponentially, like writing, we're still going to have to contend with a rather large number of repetitions to catch up to that black circuit. What can be so frustrating is at this point in the process, we may have written our new preferred thoughts hundreds of times, and yet still the black circuit is winning more often than not. Chalk that up to physics. But, lest we be too quick to loathe the system itself, let's stop and think about it. We really wouldn't want it any other way. If our brains didn't work this way, we probably wouldn't survive. It's really quite a marvelous system when you stop and think about it. And once we get the darn things configured properly, they are more likely to stay reconfigured that way. We would actually have to work hard at reversing the process. Now, at equilibrium, new information is being processed in the brain, and it's becoming equally as likely to travel down either pathway. So at this point, I am equally likely to think I don't care as I am to think I do care. I care a lot. The orange arrows running between the red and black pathways indicate Hebbian plasticity. If we fire these two circuits at the same time, we can wire them together. Now this is tremendously helpful in the process of helping our brains to locate this new circuit when we most need it. So when we catch ourselves thinking the thoughts that make up that black circuit, we want to immediately, right in the moment, stop and write down those thoughts, capture those thoughts that compose the red circuit. When our brains fire the I don't care circuit, we immediately want to fire the I do care circuit. And we want to fire that one in writing. Now this process can take some time and many repetitions, and often people ask, how many repetitions? Well, it really depends on how many times we have tried to convince ourselves that we don't care. It really is directly proportional to the number of negative thoughts that we have used to support our overeating habits. Still, people would like a number. Well, Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, suggests that it takes about 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert at something. And what we're trying to become an expert at is thinking correctly about our food choices. So developing this preferred thought process takes time and repetition. And ultimately, the more synapses we can activate with a thought or a set of thoughts, the higher that signal strength is going to be. Again, our brains are wired to pay attention to the strongest signal. That's how we filter out useless noise. That's how we stay alive. But unfortunately, it's also why we can't seem to put the fork down. This last slide is where the magic happens. At this point, the new perspective has officially taken over, and the old default is fading rapidly. At this point, the brain is officially dominated by the new way of thinking. Now, synapses, while they are fairly stable, are not permanent. We observe this in skeletal muscle, and it's called atrophy. Our brains also follow a use it or lose it strategy, just like muscle tissue. The brain borrows neuropeptides from unused pathways and recycles these in the building of new pathways. So idle neurons in the black pathway are recruited to build the red one. At this stage of change, one is much less likely to use the old way of thinking. We're still going to hear those old default thoughts, but they will not be strong enough or loud enough of an impulse to influence our behavior. Now, it could take a couple of years of practice to make this happen. How do we know our brains can do this? Well, in someone who has become blind, the neurons that formerly power the eyes get recruited to power the fingertips. This happens naturally when a blind person begins to read Braille. And we can use this same mechanism to recruit the I don't care neurons to power the new message, I do care. Now, it's not going to take us 10,000 hours to do this. In my experience, it takes about 100 days on average to get the brain to begin paying attention consistently to the red circuit, if we're doing it approximately 30 minutes a day. Now, don't misunderstand. One will be enjoying the benefits of the new way of thinking long before we've completed the process. The reason for this is that by consistently firing the red circuit, we can make the brain pay more attention to the red circuit temporarily. This is called temporary cognitive override. It's a great thing that can help us to eat right before we've even completed the circuit, but it can also fool one into thinking that he or she can discontinue with the writing. So let me emphasize, you are not done when you hit 100 days. But that is likely when you will notice a big difference. The real fact of the matter is that you are never done. But here's the good news about that. You're not going to want to be done. I guarantee that when you feel the power of this process, you will be hooked. So hooked, you will begin looking for other areas in your life to make changes. Guaranteed.